English translation 733rd contact Sunday, the 15th of March 2020, 22:03 hours.
Greetings, Edward, dear friend.
Greetings, Ptah, and welcome, dear friend. It is good to see you, because your coming gives me a bit of a break from all the work I have been doing, which has not been very pleasant during the last few months, because there have been so many glitches in the computer. But these should be solved now, because yesterday Piero and Whaley spent half a day checking it out and refurbishing it, so it seems to be orgelet again correctly. Actually, the constant terror that has lasted for years already stopped on the 12th of January, when Yanarara and Zafanat Panayach worked around here in the center for the third time, during which I was also able to take the two photos, the colored one here from the desk, then also this ship reflection behind the house. I want to add these two pictures to our conversation, at least the reflection of the prepared ship, because it will probably not be possible with the color picture.
Colored energy discharge in front of Billy's office window on the 12th of January 2020. Reflection of a ship at the Sim Yasay Silver Star Center, northern side, on the 12th of January 2020, at 1626 HRS, photographed by Billy.
Of course you can. But I also want to say that Quetzal will also be coming here because he is currently inspecting various things all around that he has in mind and that he wants to explain to you when he gets here.
Good. Then it will take some time. Consequently, we can move on to other things. Then the following, if I may bring this up. Quetzal already spoke in 1989 and I in 1995 about this now rampant epidemic, for which Bernadette also picked out these two passages from the contact reports.
Prediction by Quetzal, 230th contact of 11.10. 1989, Pleiadian Contact Reports, Volume 6, page 101.
It will be the same in the new millennium with a serious lung disease that is created by a laboratory accident. In China during criminal experiments for new biological weapons and spread throughout the world. Animals will also carry the disease, spread it, and transmit it to human beings. Also, all governments worldwide always trivialize everything and claim that this and that would not have any harmful effects on human beings or the animal and plant world, be it with regard to any gas eruptions or other escapes of substances into the air or water from chemical plants, etc., or with regard to military or secret service machinations.
Prediction by Billy, 251st contact of 3.2. 1995, Pleiadian Contact Reports, Volume 7, page 334.
There will also be an outbreak of lung disease among human beings through the fault of China, where bioweapons are being researched and pathogens are being released through carelessness. The long-standing and ever-present threat of chemical weapons being used will increase again, despite efforts elsewhere, as is also the case with nuclear as well as biological weapons.
I am aware of all this, and what you and Quetzal said at that time and what you also warned about is indisputable. And besides, the two of us had the conversation in 1995 when you mentioned it. But then when you retrieved the report of the conversation, you failed to mention when it would happen.
Yes, of course, but at that time, when I retrieved and wrote down the conversation, I deliberately did not say anything about how, where, why, and under what circumstances the whole thing of the epidemic will occur, which I called lung disease, because it is precisely the lungs that are attacked by it. We said at the time that it would not be good to name a specific time, as well as that this disease would arise in China during criminal experiments for new biological weapons, which would then be spread by a laboratory accident. And I now think that I should clarify a few things in this regard, but still not address the background and not explain it, because it is simply too blatant. However, for the sake of justice, I must clarify that the current Chinese government itself has nothing whatsoever to do with the research and experiments that led to this deadly corona disease pandemic, which basically already started with the SARS disease, when a laboratory accident led to the infection of 3 people, as a result of which the pathogens got out and triggered an epidemic. The 3 infected people then died, as did many others who were infected, just as it also happened in a new way with the coronavirus. Also this time there was a laboratory accident, and 2 people were infected with the now more advanced new and much more dangerous virus than the SARS virus. These 2 people also carried the virus out and infected several people in a market before they also died after a short time, while those infected by them quickly spread the new disease, which thus took its course, against which the Chinese government and all other responsible parties did nothing, which is to be blamed on them as irresponsibility. So the disease was able to spread very quickly and was also spread abroad, where all governments and people in charge did nothing against it, but only made big words and stupid speeches, as is still the case today and will continue to be the case. Irresponsibly, everything continued in the same style, so that all those responsible in the world effectively did nothing, neither advice nor action, and also not from the WHO, as a result of which the pandemic was able to develop and is now rampant. But as it has always been, so it will continue to be, namely in such a way that all those responsible will talk their way out of it and declare themselves innocent, give each other help in this respect, and lift themselves up to heaven in order to cover up their failure. This will be the case with all governments, the WHO and other health organizations, etc., which exist solely on the basis of taxpayers' money, but do not achieve what they should. Consequently, all those working in these organizations receive horrendous salaries, which they do not do, but rather self-importantly only make big speeches and words, but in reality completely fail in their offices as unfit people. But as far as the secret laboratories in China are concerned, where Mao Zedong ordered secret criminal research and tests for new biological weapons at the beginning of the 1970s, these have nothing to do with the Research Institute in Wuhan, nor with the Supreme Government of China. Since Mao's death, this secret research has been carried out in small secret laboratories in various places in China, and is still being carried out today by a fanatic group with a specific plan, consisting of various persons with the same interests. This group also includes a few officials close to the government, but it must be said repeatedly that the present Chinese government has nothing whatsoever to do with it. This, as well as the fact that the highest government of China has no knowledge whatsoever of what was conceived and decided at the beginning of the 1970s by Mao Zedong with regard to the secret laboratories and the invention of a dangerous biological weapon, which was then being worked on in China in various places in the area of 7 provinces, whose names I no longer know. In any case, according to Mao's idea and his will, the 7 secret laboratories were set up, and they still exist today, and are still being used in his spirit, and long after his death. In the process, laboratory accidents with evil consequences have occurred several times, causing mischief far and wide. However, the top Chinese government is equally ignorant of all this, as well as where these secret laboratories are everywhere. What is the basic purpose and reason of the dangerous secret researches regarding a biological weapon and what it will be used for?
We have to be silent about that, just as we were silent about what we were talking about earlier. But that you cannot remember the names of the 6 provinces where the secret labs were set up, I know them, namely Guangdong, Hunan, Fujian, Guizhou, Guangxi, and Jiangsu.
Yes, I guess those were the names, but I wonder if it is smart for me to name them openly when I recall our conversation and write it down.
It is possible. But when you consider the vicious consequences the whole thing of criminal research in these secret laboratories has already brought, I do not think it would be wrong for them to be searched for and possibly excavated.
Aha! And how could that be reconciled with your directives, since you are not allowed to interfere in earthly matters?
We do not do so in any way. For if I have now given you the names of provinces which you cannot remember, I have not thereby made myself culpable, for that would only be the case if I were to supply the leaders of China themselves with appropriate data which they could use for any action.
Aha, clever. But according to your research, how do you see the whole thing in relation to this virus? Your father Svath said back then, when we were together, that this virus would continue to exist underground for all time, even after a suitable vaccine had mastered the pandemic.
There will be no changing that.
Then unfortunately it is so. But what do your forecasts for the next month say?
Nothing encouraging, because the number of people infected by the virus will be in the millions and the death toll in the hundreds of thousands by the end of April. Despite the fact that certain governmental measures are being implemented in various countries, which will somewhat mitigate the rapid spread of the coronavirus pandemic. But then, when a larger part of the population reasonably begins to get used to the measures and regulations restricting daily life, these will be relaxed and lifted again far too quickly and far too soon, causing the state of infections and deaths to increase again. And this will be due to the double beanstraw stupidity, unreasonableness, and successful blackmail of the state leaders, who will bow to the demands of the entire multifarious economy, resulting in the fact that already in 1 month it will be decided to obey the blackmailing of the economic powers. This is because all the world's economic powers see in their commercial behavior which dominates them, a financial collapse which they are beginning to recognize as imminent. The leaders of many countries will irrationally and irresponsibly give in to this all-round threat and the blackmail-like demands of the economy, thereby inevitably increasing the danger of a renewed spread of the epidemic. This on the one hand, while on the other hand the governmental decrees of the relaxation of measures will lead to the fact that parts of the populations therein will erroneously assume that the great danger has been averted. Consequently, all necessary safety measures will be disregarded and negligent actions will be taken. Consequently, the infections will increase again and will also cause new deaths.
Idiotic! But nothing can be done about it, because the greed for money of all the economic bosses, as well as the stupidity, incompetence, and blackmailability of the majority of the unjust and unwise rulers, is more powerful than all reason and rationality. But look here, these questions come up again and again, because exactly last night, shortly after 1:30 HRS, a Mrs. We have already talked about homeopathy and Bach flower therapy several times. The first time was probably during our 319th conversation, if I remember correctly. I would like to talk to you about this again briefly, also because programs about it are shown over and over again on television, and many so-called medical magazines, etc., claim that homeopathy and Bach flower therapy and, in a similar context, other natural remedies, etc., which in reality are not natural remedies, are beneficial and healing. As you know, your father Svath has already taught me that the whole thing is sheer nonsense with regard to healing by such bogus remedies, as well as a fraud on the homeopathy believers, Bach flower therapy believers, and other believers in such alleged remedies. On various occasions I have also bought such bogus products myself in drugstores and tested them on various ailments and illnesses, and thus experienced for myself and had the experience that the whole thing is effectively sheer nonsense and faith-based fraud.
I can only confirm what my father taught you and what you have experienced yourself. All homeopathy and Bach flower remedies, as well as all others in the same or similar framework, correspond to a nonsense because as remedies or palliatives of these genera and species, they are all completely useless. Therefore, if human beings who take such pseudo-medicines in faith or otherwise use them because they believe in their efficacy, they fall prey to self-deception and thus to a fraud of faith, as is also the case with every religious or otherwise sectarian belief, because all products of this kind and also all beliefs are false and utterly useless. If, however, after taking such pseudo-remedies or otherwise administering them to the body, or on the basis of a belief, an improvement reaction, etc. occurs, then the whole thing is by no means the result of such a pseudo-remedy or of a prayer of faith, etc., but with 100% certainty solely of a profound delusion or delusional belief, which undoubtedly corresponds to a placebo effect. Such an effect is delusional and is caused by a so-called placebo or a placebo drug, just as it is caused by every delusion of God, which in no way corresponds to a drugless remedy, nor to a God help, because in both cases nothing active is present and consequently nothing exists. If, therefore, a placebo or dummy medicine does not contain any medicinal substance, then it cannot have any pharmacological effect that could cause and bring about a recovery, just as a delusion of God through prayers and ritual acts cannot bring about any help from God, but only a placebo effect that the human being brings about himself through the energy and power of his delusion of faith. So this is the case with religious delusion, just as it is with homeopathy and Bach flowers and all kinds of other worthless remedies and sham medicines that are supposed to function as cures but are really only placebos, which can also apply to sham operations, for example. However, this has already been discussed several times, so we should not elaborate on it wordily once more. As far as euthanasia is concerned, as well as acute suicide, and how we play our and think about it and deal with it, I would like to explain that such inhumane methods of exiting life were also practiced by us in very early times, before our distant ancestors found their way to respect for life. This was more than 52,000 years ago, and since then there has never been a single person who killed himself or got rid of his life with the help of others. We play and respect our life, as well as the life of all life forms of every species and kind, for each is given by creation, and as such is to be respected, appreciated, and honored in every situation and in every state and condition. To kill oneself or to do so with the help of others corresponds to a shamefulness and abysmal cowardice towards life, and above all to an unforgivable injustice and, moreover, to murder. The whole thing is also to be judged as profound malice and irresponsible disregard towards the creative existential law of life preservation, as this prescribes that everything and anything should always continue to exist and also develop in the best possible way. And that this is so and corresponds to the truth, proves itself by the endless evolution of everything visibly existing, which constantly adapts itself to new changing natural situations, develops anew, and keeps itself alive, as this is particularly evident in free nature.
I was also taught this by Svath, who said that the majority of Earthlings are still far too stupid and primitive to be able to understand this, because they would completely misinterpret their self-determination in such a way that they would misunderstand that it is solely aimed at determining personal evolution, and therefore the development of consciousness, or the development of ratio in the best possible way. Basically, self-determination is to be understood absolutely only in this way, as it is recognizable in nature as a whole, and it is the model in this respect. As a result of the still far underdeveloped rationality of the Earthlings, however, the majority would selfishly disregard, not use, and not necessarily develop understanding and reason as would be their duty. Consequently, the great mass of Earthlings would unjustifiably disregard, misunderstand, and destroy life upon life in a shameful and cowardly manner, the creative law of life preservation and life evolution. Self-determination, therefore, never means that the human being is allowed to determine in a high-handed way the being or non-being of his life, but only with regard to how high and far he can develop his evolution of consciousness, or the evolution of his ratio or his intellect and his reason. However, he cowardly and shamefully disregards this self-determination when it is misused to interpret it wrongly and to transform it in such a stupid and primitive way in order to cowardly destroy his own life by suicide, whereby it is irrelevant whether this is done in his own activity and thus a suicide is carried out, or whether this is done with the help of others who thereby make themselves executioners and murderers, just as those executioners and murderers are brutes who carry out death sentences pronounced by laws and judicatories.
There would be much more to explain about this, as you have also done with many human beings, but sometimes without success, because their stupidity and thus the use of intellect and reason were not responsive. And also that which you have expressed today in an explanatory way will not be such for the shameful, the cowardly, and the poor in understanding and reason, that they will remedy their stupidity, but shamefully and cowardly they will end their lives. And equally shameful, stupid, and cowardly are also all those who advocate suicide and euthanasia. But we have discussed all these topics among ourselves many times, so we should not talk about them any further now.
Wasn't my point either, because I just wanted to bring it up again briefly so that it would not be forgotten, and also to remind the readership of our contact conversations once again, and to point out that homeopathy and Bach flower therapy, as well as other similar alleged cures, are just rubbish. This is in contrast to effective natural remedies, which actually contain healing substances and are therefore also genuinely effective. Genuine. Valuable food supplements can also be used, although many earthlings are also delusional in this respect, which is why masses of such products are swallowed, even though the body does not need them. Food supplements are a huge boom around the world, whereby the manufacturers of such products create enormous fortunes for themselves. This is also the case with regard to health maintenance products and with regard to cosmetics. Lifting products and lifting injections and lifting operations for the face, forehead and eyebrows, neck and buttocks, bosom and lip plumping, etc.
Which very often looks horrible, and very especially in the case of the female sex, unappetizing, ugly, frightening, and like hideous clown masks. Very many fundamentally very pretty human beings of the female sex on Earth paint their faces and especially their lips in such a way that they destroy their charm, their dignity and their feminine beauty in such a way that it looks depraved and disgusting.
You are saying something in my sense, because I also see this war painting, and the painting of the faces and lips of earthly women in the same context. When I see those women on television who disfigure themselves with their lip disfigurement or lip painting alone in such a way that they look like old, worn-out witches and scarecrows, although they would be very pretty without their war paint, then I am overcome with horror. I often wonder whether these women are actually stupid, blind and dumb, because they obviously cannot see that they are completely destroying their prettiness by plastering themselves with paint, or also just painting their lips hideously and thus disfiguring themselves. A woman is only really pretty and beautiful when she looks completely natural, without face paint and lip smearing. Of course, she must also be well groomed, for which creams, powders, and toiletries, etc. can of course be used, but not paints, and above all no lipsticks and no eyebrow paste. Just as your female sex does and thus remains completely natural and preserves prettiness and beauty.
The female bad habit in this respect is unfortunately widespread throughout the world.
You can really say unfortunately to that, for all those women who think that they would look more advantageous with their war and clown paint on their faces, which is exactly the opposite. But now something else, because now I want to talk openly about what we, when we sometimes talk about it, actually only talk about among ourselves. Namely about the Nazis and Hitler, because questions keep coming up from everywhere, and also on television, as to whether the criminal of humanity really killed himself or ran away to Argentina. What do you think?
This can very well be talked about openly, because it is not a secret, nor does it have to be kept quiet if you do not mention anything about what my father Svath and you.
All right. I do not want to talk about that either. I just want to say that the idiotic conspiracy theories are absolute nonsense, that Hitler and his Eva fled to Argentina. There must have been a Hitler lookalike and an Eva lookalike who were built up as Hitler and Eva Braun during years of hard training in the 1930s. And consequently both became so perfect in their roles that the uninitiated could not tell the difference between them and the real thing. Only the two closest confidants around Hitler knew the truth, for all those involved in building up and training the two doubles were liquidated. These doubles were also provided with false papers in the names of Hitler and his Eva Braun, just as they were given false papers and fled to Argentina when the Soviets attacked, while Hitler himself and his wife Eva holed up in the Führer bunker in Berlin and really blessed their time. The lie, however, is that the criminal killed himself and his wife because he was too cowardly to do so, so he and Eva Braun were shot by two fanatics who listened to him, which was then presented as suicide and also recorded as such. Hitler himself was really too cowardly to shoot his Eva and commit suicide, after which the two executioners, loyal and completely obedient to Hitler until death, killed him and his Eva Braun on the 30th of April 1945 at 15:33 hours with 2 shots to the head. The two Hitler confidants had already held discussions about this days before, during which the two Hitler fanatics swore to draw up false, lying protocols, just as the two Hitler fanatics also vowed to maintain silence about everything until their deaths, and to let Hitler continue to exist as an allegedly courageous suicide hero even after his death. This explains from the point of view of reality how it actually happened and what actually happened, completely different from the lying and falsified protocols in the later statements of the two murderers.
You already explained that 32 years ago, I also found confirming records for that in my father's annals. And also for the fact that you two moved in the future in the present time and experienced what is happening with the corona epidemic, but which you were not allowed to talk about. Also, today you have to keep certain of the connections to yourself because
It would be too much to say openly, so please do not talk about it.
But I may now speak about what I had already mentioned on the 30th of November, which my father had already announced to you in 1945, that the niece of Professor Carl Gustav Jung, whom you met in July 1945, would come to see you in the 1980s and then immediately tell Wendell Stevens about you, and he would come to see you immediately. The two of you then also gained trust in each other and became friends, as I know, which is why you then also entrusted him with so much information, about which, however, you otherwise remain silent, and also still have to remain silent today, such as with regard to the epidemic emanating from China, about which you have now remained silent for 75 years, because...
Excuse me, it really has to stay that way also now. And that I told Wendell some things about the plague. I only did that because Svath told me at that time that I should do that because Wendell was supposed to pass on the knowledge about the corona plague to a woman whose name I no longer remember, but who was supposed to be commissioned by Wendell to warn the world about the plague that would emanate from Guangdong for the first time, and from Wuhan for the second time. To my knowledge, he then did that, because he knew the woman in question personally, as he told me, but I have never heard anything about her actually warning the world about it. I also gave Wendell other information that I had received from Sim Yase, for example about kidnappings, etc., which he passed on to the woman, but I have also never heard anything about this, precisely that this woman had gone public with it. But as far as the plague is concerned, there are still things pending which I am not allowed to talk about openly even today.
But we can do that between ourselves because, as I told you earlier, there are some things that interest me that you could explain to me. The woman's name, by the way, was Sylvia Brown, as this is recorded in my father's annals, to which he also wrote that this woman had been dishonest and selfish and had misused all information for profit and had acted falsely as a predictor.
That means fortune teller. But then that was probably the reason why he telephoned me after the tower disaster that he had ended contact with this woman, because something unpleasant had happened with her. But between us we can talk about it, which really has to remain purely private.
It may be as you say regarding Wendell and the woman, but earlier I wanted to mention something else, and that is, as well as about a picture recording that...
No, please. That should be enough, Pta'a, because what you were about to say just now is something that should also not be said openly, and I also do not want to talk about... It should now be clear, even without this matter, that Eva Braun and Hitler were not shot by two of his fanatical followers on his orders, because the scumbag was too cowardly to judge himself, and therefore 2 of his followers took matters into their own hands in order to save him from capture by the Soviets and from their brutality, etc. It is to be regretted that Eva Braun and Hitler were not shot by the Soviets, because the scumbag was too cowardly to judge himself. Eva Braun was to be pitied here, who was horrified when the 2 Hitler confidants appeared and announced to them that the Soviets were approaching, and also explained what they were now going to do, and then also shot without further ado with their pistols, which they already had in their hands when they entered, so that Hitler and Eva Braun or Hitler could not even say anything back. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun had also surrounded themselves with 2 pairs of doppelgangers, which was largely concealed and thus kept secret, as was the fact that they sometimes came to the fore while Hitler or Eva Braun were elsewhere in safety. One of the 2 pairs of doppelgangers was so similar to the originals that no differences could be discerned, so to speak, also with regard to the way of speaking, the movements, the behavior, and mannerisms. Therefore, during certain appearances, not even Hitler's direct staff noticed that Hitler pushed his practically perfect doppelganger forward when an appearance seemed too risky. Also, there were never any suspicions, etc., because only his 2 fanatics knew about the whole thing, who then shot Hitler and his wife, who was finally married to him, so that they would not fall into Russian captivity, of which Hitler was hellishly afraid. The 2 fanatics were then practically the executioners who executed Hitler and Eva Braun, because Hitler was too cowardly to do so, although he had been proclaiming for some time that he would kill himself if everything went wrong. But when the time came that his delusion of world domination did not come true, he broke down psychologically and staggered around in the bunker like a sad heap of misery. And then, full of miserable fear and cowardice, he hid in the bunker with his wife. Whereupon the 2 fanatics who had listened to him joined forces and decided to kill their boss and his wife before the Russians could get hold of him, the man obsessed with world domination. So the 2 conspirators went into the room of Hitler and Eva Braun, where they both sat on a couch and were murdered. First, Hitler was shot by his personal aide-de-camp and body servant, and then, a few seconds later, Eva Braun, who was Mrs. But the 2 executioners concealed this all their lives and, moreover, falsified this fact mendaciously, because they knew very well that they would have been made to pay for it, and would also have been shot away from the present by Hitler's SS killer comrades of the bunker crew, etc., even after the war by neo-Nazis and other Hitler fanatics. And since they remained silent, it never became known what really happened at that time, so nothing of these secret events ever reached the public, just as nothing ever reached the ears of the Russians and Americans. And the 2 executioners were able to keep this secret all their lives.
They also did so, in fact, for they both kept silent and died, as they had resolved their silence with an oath. But, Edouard, to say all this openly will again bring dangers for you, for confused Hitler supporters will fanatically refuse to believe the truth, even at the present time, and will deny it, as chroniclers and other historians will do on the basis of false protocols and records of court proceedings, as well as false journalistic reports.
Yes, I suppose it must be so, because as usual I will probably be accused of lying and cheating by all the know-it-alls who only glean their wisdom from allegations. Minutes of lies, false transcripts and mendacious reporting, testimony, journalist reports and conjecture. It will be these, as well as Hitler fans, who will then come forward and insult me or want to kill me. It will be as in regard to my contacts with you, for what must not be true for know-it-alls. Envious, lunatics, and confused, as well as for antagonists, liars and slanderers, hate-mongers, and other behaviorally disturbed people of all kinds, simply must not be true.
You should not see the whole thing so simply and lightly, Edouard, for the malignancies, lies, slander, and Gewalt, activities against you out of hatred and envy, etc., are not to be underestimated. As you know from your former conjugal days and the connections arising out of them from your then-wife, dear friend, you should consider the enemies and adversaries brought about against you by her, who unthinkingly and in stupidity have become believers in her, and have since then and to this day hatefully spread insults and hostilities directed against you. As a result of their lies and calumnies, Dangerous attacks have also been made against your life and it.
It's all right, Ptah. Excuse me for interrupting you, but what you say I am aware of and do not forget. Unfortunately, however, it is the case that human beings are sick in their ratiocination, who from the beginning or in the course of their lives live in ignorance and unreason. Consequently, they are also pathologically cross-stupid, hateful, envious, primitive, and otherwise insane. But it is these who allow themselves to be influenced by lies and slander, and themselves become liars and slanderers, because they are incapable and always balance on the edge of stupefaction. Hence they themselves also fall prey to hatred, and are also incapable of their own consistent thinking and decision-making.
That is probably correct, but this knowledge cannot save you from the harm of those who, in their stupidity and simple-mindedness, can neither recognize nor understand reality or its truth.
You are also right, dear friend, but we should not now get into psychological matters which are not understood by all those in their idiocy and stupidity who live under the delusion that they have to insult and slander me and finish me off with threats and attacks, etc. But do not realize that with all their actions and behavior they are not harming me but only themselves. Well, actually, I wanted to say something more about the Hitler affair, namely that the Hitlerian lookalike couple, who had been cut out of Hitler's and Eva Braun's faces, bodies, language, and manner of speaking, as well as their movements, mannerisms, and behavior, fled to Argentina, where more than 18,000 Nazi henchmen had also fled. Svath explained that, years before the World War, the doppelganger couple had secretly rehearsed and learned Hitler's movements, speeches, behavior, etc., so that they could perform in Hitler's manner without being bothered. Thus, this Hitler-Eva Braun lookalike couple also acted as doubles in the Reich for photographs and films, such as private life recordings, which were also distributed as real Hitler-Eva Braun films and as real Hitler-Eva Braun photos, thus deceiving the Reich people and the world.
All this is also known to me from the annals of my father Svath, as I have confirmed to you in our earlier private conversations.
You have, my friend. But I think we should move away from this subject and talk about something else, such as the fact that lately I have been receiving UFO reports by telephone, email, and also in writing from all over the world, about some strange flying objects being observed for up to 15 or 20 minutes, passing by one after the other like a long chain high in the sky, and completely silent. I am sometimes allowed to publish these reports of sightings, while other observers, both men and women, wish me to keep quiet about them and not to disclose their reports or names. Obviously, it is about those unknown flying objects, which we have talked about together several times, because you also have these UFO phenomena or UFO activities in your focus, and you have told me various things about it. Also in relation to what the reason for the whole of these UFO operations actually is, or what the ultimate background for it is and what is intended with it in the end.
I also told you to keep quiet about that and not to make any statements about it when asked.
I also adhere to this. Ptah, for I do not pass on a word of what you have explained to me, what you have just investigated concerning the origin of these flying objects, which are UFOs for the Earthlings. I am also silent with regard to your explanations of the tasks, aspirations and purposes, as well as the meanings of these UFOs GRI and their increased flights, etc., which you have found out with your much higher technical possibilities than are proper to the satellites and fellow satellites of this grouping. What I have answered in each case was only related to the fact that these flying objects do not belong to you, Plejaren, and in no way correspond to your Plejaren techniques. These are satellites, which, according to your information, despite their higher earthly technology, are still extremely primitive, just like the objects of the other two groups, which are also still very poorly developed compared to your technology. Consequently, as you explain again and again, these two foreign groups with their UFOs are also not able to locate you, Plejaren, your presence and your beam ships, and just as they, at least the one in spite of their higher earthly technology, are also not able to perceive, and therefore not able to determine that they are being observed, investigated, and screened by you in their secret machinations, and that you are only allowed to tell this realization to me in confidence and obliged to silence, I can fully understand, because, well, various telephone calls and letters from different persons from Germany, Austria, Switzerland, as well as from England, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, and Poland, etc., contain questions as to whether these persons are in fact the same as the others. These telephone calls and letters include questions as to whether these observed UFOs/objects are Plejaren beam ships, which I of course always deny, as I have already said, which is effectively true, because the observed UFOs are in no case flying objects from Plejaren, but on the one hand earthly vehicles as well as satellites and flying apparatuses of other origin. The observed earthly UFOs/objects, which are only called such because they are also unknown to the observers, who have nothing to do with the satellites, belong on the one hand to a special grouping, about which I am not supposed to give any information, while on the other hand further observations refer to another and moreover traditional grouping in a completely different context. I have also been receiving reports of sightings of these for decades, whereby these UFOs/objects, however, refer to a traditional grouping that has been circling around in the earthly skies for a long time. That is to say, already in the last century and the century before last, and partly even much longer ago. They are still doing so today, causing fear in some earthlings and euphoria in others, especially when they are generally misled about this grouping by their own fantasies. About the other grouping, however, precisely those whose UFOs, as they are called by the ignorant observers, I am not supposed to explain anything in detail, because on the one hand you advise me against it for good reasons. On the other hand, well, because for another reason it would also be irresponsible to say anything. Irresponsible, in fact, towards my security, which I am not supposed to put at risk anymore, as you said. So I just keep quiet and let the earthlings wonder one day what the UFO fairy lights are really about, which stretch across the night sky. That can well be explained and said, but you have obliged me to keep silent about what the ultimate purpose will be in reality, and if we talk somewhat mysteriously about these UFOs/objects and their operators as well as about this grouping itself, which is connected with these objects, then this may appear mysterious to outsiders. Although it is not mysterious, but it would not be good for me personally to say anything more about it, but simply to let it be known that the earthlings will still be surprised. But perhaps you could say something about it, which may be said and which is also openly circulating on the internet. The unpleasant things that the earthlings will be surprised about one day do not have to be mentioned. But if you can perhaps say something more about it?
I can do that. Because officially the convoys of lights in the night sky are objects that correspond to a so-called Starlink project of the U.S. space company SpaceX under Elon Musk and Gwynne Shotwell, as part of a planned world-spanning satellite network that is to provide comprehensive internet access in the USA from mid-2020, but will then also be used worldwide in 2021. The purported objective of SpaceX's Starlink project is to create a global broadband internet belt around the Earth, to be assembled on a fleet of between 12,000 and 42,000 satellites. What will ultimately become of all this, however, would be unpleasant, although in this respect there are only concrete ideas but no firm plans as yet, which, according to our view of the future in this respect, make it clear what will develop out of all this, namely exactly what I have explained to you and about which you are to remain silent. 2 years ago, I confided in you that such satellites would be placed in relatively low orbits around the Earth, and that they would receive data from ground stations and transmit them to each other by laser. To this, I also explained that for the time being, this satellite network is to provide wide area fast and at the same time low-cost internet access in the USA, but that if the whole enterprise can be carried through to the end and completed to the last, something very unpleasant will result from it, as I explained to you privately on the 1st of January 2017.
Exactly. That is what you said, and what will be then the earthlings will then wonder about. This is in addition to the fact that, oh, well, it is probably better to keep quiet about that too. But what I read on Wikipedia, according to SpaceX boss Elon Musk, 500 satellites should be enough for this project launched in the USA. However, between 800 and 1200 satellites should then be enough to make worldwide coverage possible. Each additional satellite, however, would enable an even greater bandwidth for individual internet connection, which means, in other words, that the more satellites would be launched into the sky and orbit, the faster a connection to this satellite network would be for individual users. On the one hand, this is what is said, but on the other hand, something else. So here, too, as with the corona plague, lies are being told, including that in summer 2020, the number of 500 satellites will be reached and will be sufficient to start operations in the USA and to provide Americans with high-performance internet connections from space. The prices should then be within a competitive range. A satellite is supposed to require a long preparation time, about 14 months from order to positioning in space, and the high technical effort and the production of the satellite is supposed to cost more than 100 million euros. SpaceX is supposed to be able to launch 26 or 27 satellites per rocket, whereby the requested number of satellites per orbital plane always corresponds to a multiple of 25, whatever this somehow crazy statement is supposed to mean. In addition, there is always a spare satellite, whereby 27 satellites with a mass of 386 kilograms each are supposed to weigh just under 10.5 tons, which is just under the maximum load capacity of the currently largest payload adapter in the Falcon 9 in the rocket's user guide, where it is also not explained what this explanation, which is incomprehensible to a layman, is all about. In total, 177 launches would cost $11 billion if sold at the commercial launch price of a Falcon 9 rocket that could not be reused $62 million per launch. By reusing the first stage of the rocket, the commercial price of a Falcon 9 rocket is expected to drop by about 1/3 to around $40 million. Future development stages of the Falcon 9 should be able to be reused more frequently, which would then bring the cost down even further. So that is what I could find on Wikipedia on the internet. However, as far as the other numerous objects are concerned, some of which are circling around in the night sky in completely different orbits and even join the satellite convoys in isolated cases, these have nothing to do with these SpaceX satellites.
That is correct, but you know that all that should be said here is what can be said, consequently we should...
That's good. I just wanted to clarify things a little bit. Although it has not been said what the final unpleasantness will be with regard to the satellite program or what will happen behind the other, well, what we will just keep quiet about.
Which we will also stick to in the future anyway.
Sure. Once again I had to ask you about the elimination of trees, this time the tree of Fuchsbüll above Balm, Wetzikon, which was eliminated by your daughter Simyase. Christian is writing a bigger thing about this, especially because of the antagonistic hostilities of Kal Korff, etc. I told you that Christian would have to be more precise in this matter in order to be able to describe everything correctly. On the 28th of January, I was with Cuneo at the weekly grocery shopping in Wetzikon, which I do every week, as you know, and since we usually pass by the Fuchsbüll on our way home, we went to see what the situation was like there today. This is exactly where I had to take the photos of her beam ships in February 1975, according to your daughter's instructions, which circled around the 14-meter fir tree there and even touched it deeply in places. But then Simyase suddenly disappeared, together with the tree, which she apparently eliminated at the same time. At least that's how I understood it. And she told me to drive away immediately. Not back to the main road, but into the forest and to the village of Hitnau. So I just pocketed the camera and sped off on my moped. The whole meadowland where I photographed is now plowed over, so I can no longer find out exactly where the tree was, and that's exactly what Christian needs to know now. The tree in question was about 10-12 meters to the right of a small house in the meadow, as seen from the road and the edge of the forest where I was standing and photographing. It was or is probably still a weekend house or something. This tree was then irradiated and eliminated by Simyase. The memory of this tree was then erased from the owners there, as well as from other residents. At least that's what Simyase explained to me later.
Unfortunately, I could not explain anything to you about that. Because you had to photograph there according to my daughter's instructions, namely the big tree you mentioned, as well as her flying apparatus, which was the most important aspect of it. However, I was not informed about this at the time because I had nothing to do with it. Therefore, I first had to search the records regarding the events that my daughter, Simyase, had recorded at that time, as I also had to ask her personally. Consequently, I can only tell you the circumstances of that time today. Her records and statements began when you were repeatedly followed by various persons during your excursions to contact places, also by police officers and by special military services. It is also a fact that you were even shot at, and only by a stroke of luck were you not fatally shot. However, the fact that you survived such attacks 23 times unharmed was always due to strange coincidences. Such life-threatening attacks on you have also occurred several times in the presence of core group members such as Silvano, Jacobus, Maria, and Engelbert, as was also the case some time ago when Daniel was present, who was very endangered and, in my opinion, could not understand the danger he was in. So you were aware of the persecutions, which is why you also always unquestioningly behaved according to the instructions of my daughter Simyase, and also at the place Fuchsbuel above Balm Wetzikon when she told you to leave as quickly as possible and not to lose any time. And this instruction was because one of these secret pursuers was Hans Jacob from Wetzikon, who had been spying on you for some time and, in his delusion, suspected that he could photograph you having a tryst with the devil.
Yes, I can imagine that, because he also claimed and spread the story halfway around the world that, as I rode my moped along the road close to his house in Wetzikon, he saw the devil squatting on the back of the luggage rack of my moped, riding along and grinning wickedly at him.
This is known to me, but now I want to tell you what interesting information I have found in the notes of my daughter Simyase, what I have read and what I have meanwhile also learned from her personally. The tree around which Simyase steered her flying apparatus and partly also into its branches was not in fact at the place where you saw it and my daughter's flying apparatus and took your photographs, as you were instructed to do. The place there was just very ideal, the tree being about 10 meters away from the northernmost tree of the small building, where you could photograph it from the road and from the edge of the forest, together with the flying apparatus that was being moved all around. The terrain, however, was only good and ideal on the upper level, because a few meters further down it fell away steeply where you could not have stood and also could not have photographed, which is why the tree and the flying apparatus were projected in real terms onto the upper level where—
Wait, what do you mean it was projected? I do not understand that.
That was actually not explained to you, I know, because that is from my daughter's notes regarding what happened. Because at that time, according to my daughter's explanations, you were so burdened with bad marital problems and with your wife's jealousy towards my daughter Simyase that she could not expect you to also be burdened with technical explanations that were completely unknown to you. Now, however, I can easily explain to you what happened at that time, if you take this photograph here in your filing for comparison, which you took about 4 weeks ago of the flying apparatus manipulated by Yanarara and Zafanat Paneach, which was visible behind the center, although it hovered directly above the house but was mirrored off to the side and visible to you, and you were therefore able to photograph it.
Aha. So Florina had already heard something like that from you when she said 3 days ago that some strange things, which I could not figure out.
It must have been about this thing because I informed her to tell you that I would soon be able to let you know how everything happened then, and I want to do that now. In reality, the tree in Fuchsbuel was not in the meadow where you took the photo, but deep below the steeply sloping hillside that sloped several meters behind the tree. Under.
Wait a minute, please, look here. This is a drawing plan that Christian beamed to me, and there I could draw in red pencil where...
We can do that later, because right now I want to explain what I know about what happened back then. Below the slope, there was a large group of trees and bushes on the right side of the road leading through the field on the way from the main road past the farm buildings towards the forest. At the very end of this group of bushes and trees, just to the right of the road to the north, stood the coniferous tree about 14 meters high, around which Sim Yase circled with her flying apparatus and also penetrated between its branches. So the tree was not at the place where you had to photograph the whole of my daughter's demonstration, but far behind and below the slope, which you could not see from where you were standing. The whole thing happened because Sim Yase was watching your pursuer, namely Hans Jacob, who was equipped with binoculars, a camera, and also a film camera and was spying on you, but she did not tell you this, nor did she ever later. Therefore, she also did not order you to the place below the slope to take the intended photographs there, but above the slope on the upper field road to the edge of the forest, in order to project a real projection of the conifer and her flying apparatus onto the meadow there. Subsequently, you photographed a real projection without knowing and noticing that it was a real projection. And because my daughter kept quiet about it, you also never knew that you had photographed a real projection of the tree and my daughter's flying apparatus. Just as you also did not know that Hans Jacob had been secretly following you for many weeks, and that he was also spying on you while you were carrying out your task. So for my daughter, Sim Yase, the reason was given that only you could see and photograph everything, which is why she ordered you to the place of projection and not to the place where the tree really stood, and it was then also eliminated there by her.
Good, then that's how it was, but Sim Yase never told me about it.
Unfortunately, her silence had to be. That's how she listed it in her notes and now also explained it to me personally. The reason for which was because you were also being followed and observed during this task, and she did not want to get you excited. That is why my daughter also ordered you to that place where the event could then take place. So the person following you was Hans Jacob, who had been secretly watching you for some time and secretly followed you everywhere without you noticing him. That was also the case on that day. So my daughter resorted to the ruse of a real projection, because the place she had first intended seemed unsuitable for her to be able to carry out your work unmolested. So she ordered you to the place you knew and carried out the real projection so that you could take the necessary photographs. I should also explain that, according to my daughter's notes, Hans Jacob parked his vehicle on another and higher road and crept on foot not far from your location in order to observe the whole thing closely with binoculars. His creeping up took a long time, however, so that he could only briefly perceive what was happening from a distance of about 20 meters and could no longer use his photo camera. When Sim Yase noticed him between the forest trees and then at the edge of the forest and he wanted to take a picture, this was the reason for my daughter to immediately stop the projection and instruct you to drive away as quickly as possible. That's why you also immediately drove away on your small motorbike before Hans Jakob could run towards you.
I do not quite understand, because the tree in question was, as you say, far below the steep slope, which could not be seen from the upper road and the edge of the forest where I was standing, as I discovered together with Cuneo, and which I have only known since I went with him to the place in question below the slope. So, according to your explanation, the whole thing should have taken place under this slope on the field road, because obviously no one was at home in the houses below on the slope at that time. Because Sim Yase was still saying at that time that there were no persons present far and wide, which, however, I had misunderstood to refer to the small weekend house.
According to the records and my daughter's explanations, that must have been the case. To this she stated that her observation and findings had revealed that Hans Jacob would have gone through the meadow to the hillside, and could have observed and photographed everything from above if she had ordered you to the original site of the tree on the lower field road instead of the upper forest road. But that was not at all what she had in mind, which is why she chose a real projection and carried out everything as I have described it to you. And as the records state, Hans Jacob was often after you when you were directed to certain places to take photos and films.
I see. Good. That's clear now. And then I'm sure that was also the reason why Sim Yase sometimes chased me around the areas like that.
That's how it was, because that's how she recorded it, too.
Sure, must have been like that. But thank you for your efforts so you could let me know now. But now what is with this plan here? Can I use this red pencil to draw in approximately here, where the real projection must have been?
No, that is not correct. Because according to Sim Yase's explanation, the projection should have been about here, while here must have been your location. Down here, moreover, the coniferous tree around which she had circled with her flying apparatus.
Then I will cover my hasty drawing in with this Tombow correction tape, and make the new marking like this and like this, if that is correct?
I think that is correct. Now down here, you can still make a cross at the end of the 4 black dots, which marks the tree that was there at the time and was used as a suitable object by my daughter.
Okay, so it is good now?
That should correspond to what Sim Yase explained to me. Here you can still draw in approximately the locations of Hans Jacob and of his vehicle, as recorded for me by my daughter.
Good, that gives us everything. Many thanks for your efforts, for which Christian will also be grateful.
The whole thing was interesting for me. Send my greetings and thanks to Christian for his work, which I have observed for many years. He always carries out very conscientiously, as do all the other members, through whose cooperation so far much more has been created worldwide than any of them can imagine. It is.
Greetings, my friend.
Hello, Quetzal. Greetings and welcome too.
My time is a bit short, because I stayed around the center too long. Consequently, I have to leave again. All around, I found everything in good order, although there are still 2 jobs that need to be done. Firstly, there are still ceiling wire ropes in the outer chicken yard area. Furthermore, in the upper part of the chicken yard, which is close to the house, a covering should still be carried out, which should be completed before summertime. What will also still have to be done concerns the trees around the garden to the left of the pile. These are the things that still need to be done and should be done immediately.
Okay, we will take care of that. I will also inform Andreas regarding the chicken yard part close to the house. I will have to discuss the work in the lower chicken yard with Atlantis.
What is also still to come is the following. Furthermore, the felled wood should be.
I have already initiated some of this, or have already done some of it myself. Other things I have discussed with Jacobus, who will take care of the arrangements regarding the wood clearing.
He should also see to it that the wild wood storage areas are removed as quickly as possible, so that those storage areas are also tidy and clean, as should also be the case with regard to the access road, which time and again shows pothole damage as a result of motor vehicles driving too fast, which can possibly lead to accidents.
This is unfortunately an evil, I know, but people's sanity is limited. Consequently, they always speed and produce potholes despite warnings. But what I want to ask you now, that relates to this.
As far as the whole thing is concerned, I can explain to you in confidence that, but this should only be informative for you. I would also like to mention your oratory, for you are unusually eloquent, and always manage to amaze me with your precise, exact, and detailed explanations, which make everything understandable and comprehensible. But now I have to go. Goodbye.
Thank you, and also goodbye.
I can only agree with the words of Quetzal.
Thank you. But look here. I got this article from Achim for a Zeitzeichen issue. The whole thing shows exactly what kind of evil Christian-minded tramp Trump is, who fancies himself as a dictatorial world ruler and in this way insults, threatens and imposes sanctions and punitive tariffs, etc. on all those states that do not suit him and do not dance to his tune. However, the whole thing also shows how the same Christian attitude prevails among the evangelical sect delusionists, which is also the case in principle with all religions and their direct or indirect, as well as other delusionist sects and their members, as I've experienced and witnessed around the world with all delusionists. In the case of all religious and sectarian believers of all kinds and types, their faith in God, peacefulness and love were always only vapid oral professions, which only lasted and stood in the foreground in terms of speech until something ran counter to their wishes, hopes, expectations, opinions, or their desire, their personal security, greed for advantage or profit, etc. Then, in a flash, their loudness of faith disappeared and brought wicked Gvault to the fore, up to murder and manslaughter, war and terror, whereby insults, threats, and slander of all imaginable kinds were effectively and directly only harmless verbal degenerations. In fact, I have seen and experienced all the degenerate behavior I have just mentioned in countless believers of all the main religions and in many sects and their believers endlessly and equally around the world. In every person with delusions of God, regardless of religion or sect, the delusions of God and the great delusions of faith lasted only until one's own security, personal advantage, and benefit were no longer given. Then all delusions of God, all imagined love, goodness, love of one's neighbor, peacefulness, and humanity collapsed and made way for evil Gvault with murder, hatred, manslaughter, war, terror, and destruction, etc., etc. But hear what is written here in this article I read to you.
Trump's speech to hypocritical evangelicals Monday, the 6th of January, 2020, by Freeman at 11 o'clock hours.
Listen to Trump's speech in Miami, Florida last Saturday, hosted by the evangelicals, the Christians for Trump, who are anything but Christians. Anyone who advocates genocide, murder, and war in the name of America and Israel cannot possibly be a Christian. This is all theater, hypocritical posturing, which the Yanks do best. On stage, Trump was praised to heaven by the preachers, and then they prayed together. What an Oscar-worthy spectacle. Who they are really worshiping is Satan, the father of lies. His speech started from minute 6 o'clock.
On my orders, the United States military executed a flawless attack that terminated the terrorist leaders responsible for gravely wounding and killing thousands of people, and at least hundreds of Americans. Qasem Soleimani has been killed, and his bloody rampage has ended forever. The so-called Christians cheered. He was planning attacks against Americans, but now we made sure his atrocities are stopped forever. He was planning a large-scale attack, and we got him. And cheers again. We are a peace-loving nation, and my administration remains firmly committed to peace and harmony among the nations of the world. We seek no war, no state reconstruction, and no regime change. But as president, I will never hesitate to defend the safety of the American human beings, you. Cheers. So let this be a warning to the terrorists. If you value your own lives, do not threaten the lives of our citizens. Cheers. Americans have many blessings, but the greatest among them is the blessing of being protected by the most extraordinary and virtuous military on God's earth.
Freeman, every word, and I mean every word Trump is lied.
General Soleimani had traveled to Baghdad on a diplomatic mission at the invitation of Iraqi government leader Abdul Mahdi. A meeting between the two was scheduled for the morning of the 3rd of January. In other words, Trump had a guest of the government assassinated on Iraqi soil who was going to deliver a message from the Iranian government in response to a Saudi initiative, with Iraq acting as a mediator. According to the report, Soleimani was on a peace mission to improve the strained relations between Tehran and Riyadh. Therefore, the Saudi regime has not commented positively on the murder, as it tries to defuse regional tensions. The government in Baghdad informed Washington in advance about Soleimani's mission. So it was no secret he would be flying to Baghdad from Beirut on the 2nd of January on a scheduled flight. The murder ordered by Trump is thus the worst crime in international diplomacy that can be committed. According to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations (VCD), government officials on diplomatic missions are under special protection and are untouchable because of immunity, cannot be punished. What Trump has authorized is a declaration of war. So much for America being a peace-loving nation. And has Trump never heard of the fifth commandment? Thou shalt not kill. He's a friggin' murderer with these blatant lies. I'm surprised the ceiling of the hall did not come crashing down on the hollow heads of the cheering crowd, because they deserved it for their bloodthirsty roars. Source: Trump's Rede vor Scheinheiligen Evangelikern, SRKSP.
Neither from the persons of the evangelicals nor from President Trump was and is anything else to be expected. For all of them are so-called believers in religion and God, and to all of these their hypocrisy and humanity and peace is only proper and sacred as long as they themselves remain unmolested. As with all believers in religion and God, their hypocrisy also applies to Trump and the evangelicals only as long as their security and their personal well-being, as well as their material property, remain unharmed. But if this security is no longer given with all of them, then they fall prey to evil acts of violence. These then degenerate very quickly as a result of hatred, even to the point of torture, murder, manslaughter, and rape. Violent crime, war, terror, and destruction, as has demonstrably been the case with all earthly peoples since time immemorial, is also the case today and will continue to be so far into the future. For as long as religions and sects continue to exist, and with them delusions of God and other delusions, earth humans will not find true and lasting peace, nor will they find the path and become true human beings.
That is, after all, proving itself over and over again, and it will also remain so during and after the corona plague, if I may say so.
There is nothing to be said against that, but now we should discuss the following, which then, however, does not belong in public, if you call up our conversation and write it down.